January 1960, Phuoc Heap Village, Ben Tre Province, South Vietnam. South Vietnamese army soldiers have occupied the village. They have arrested and executed 20 young men. They've buried the bodies around the army post as a warning, a gruesome message to anyone who might think about resisting the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. A woman arrives. She is 39 years old. She has already been imprisoned by the French, watched her husband die in a colonial jail, raised a son, mostly alone, and spent 2 decades working in the revolutionary underground. She has carried weapons disguised as fish sauce jars. She has crossed enemy lines on foot. Her name is Nguyễn Thị Định. She recruits 5,000 women from 6 villages. They march on the district headquarters. They stay for 5 days and 5 nights, singing, refusing to leave, demanding the soldiers leave. They convince some of those soldiers to change sides. On the 5th day, the district chief agrees to their demands. The army withdraws from Phuoc Heap. It is the beginning of something called the Long-Haired Army, and it will make the most powerful military in the world deeply, genuinely nervous. Welcome back to Women Struck from History. Today's story is set during the Vietnam War, a conflict you've probably heard about, narrated almost entirely through the lens of American soldiers, American commanders, and American politicians. The women who fought in that war, who were, in fact, the majority of the National Liberation Front's ground combatants in many areas, have been largely written out of the Western account. Nguyễn Thị Định was not just any woman who fought in that war. She was described as, in the words of historians of Vietnam, the most important Southern woman revolutionary in the war. She founded and commanded the Long-Haired Army. She rose to become deputy commander of the entire South Vietnam Liberation Armed Forces. She was the first woman in Vietnamese history to hold the rank of Major General. She was also, when the war ended, one of the people most responsible for building the Women's Museum that now stands in Hanoi, ensuring that women's contributions to the war were preserved before they could be forgotten. This is her story. Nguyễn Thị Định was born on March 15, 1920, in Luong Hoa village, Ben Tre Province, a region in the Mekong Delta south of Saigon, famous for its coconut groves and its long tradition of resistance against foreign powers. Ben Tre had been under French colonial rule since the 1860s. The Dinh family were farmers, poor, with strong anti-colonial sympathies. One of her older brothers was already involved in the independence movement. Jean had admired him intensely. At 16, she joined the revolutionary movement herself. She was a teenager, distributing leaflets, carrying messages, doing the groundwork of underground organizing. At 18, she joined the Indochinese Communist Party, an organization founded by Ho Chi Minh that would eventually lead the fight for Vietnamese independence. At 19, she married a fellow revolutionary, Nguyen Van Bich. 3 days after she gave birth to their son, her husband was arrested by French authorities. He was sent to a prison island called Con Dao, where political prisoners were held in brutal conditions. He died there. 6 months after her husband's arrest, Jean herself was arrested and sent to Ba Ra prison. She was imprisoned for 3 years. She was released in 1943 due to severe heart disease. The French let her go because they thought she was too ill to cause trouble. They were wrong. By 1944, Jean had quietly reconnected with the revolutionary network. And in August 1945, when the Viet Minh rose up to seize power from the French at the end of World War II, Jean was part of the uprising in Ben Tre. The following year, she was trusted with a mission. She was sent north to Hanoi to report on the southern resistance and to bring back weapons and ammunition for the fighters in Ben Tre. Getting weapons from the north to the south, past French checkpoints and patrols on the waterways, was not simple. Jean's solution was characteristic. She disguised a boat full of weapons by loading it with fishing nets and stacking fish sauce jars along the deck. The boat looked like a fishing vessel. She got the weapons through. Jean was not just a political figure or a symbolic leader. She was operationally brilliant. She understood deception, logistics, and the psychology of the enemy. She knew how to be invisible. Over the next decade and a half, as Vietnam was divided, the French defeated, the North reunified under the Communists, the South under the US-backed Diem government, Jean remained in Ben Tre, organizing, recruiting, waiting. And then came January 1960. and Phuoc Heap. That same year, she became a founding member of the National Liberation Front, the NLF, the political and military organization that would come to be known in America as the Viet Cong. She was at the founding meeting. She helped write the organization into existence. And she had an idea. The long-haired army, Doi Quan Toc Dai in Vietnamese, was not just a military unit. It was a strategic innovation. Jin understood something that the American military high command would spend years failing to grasp. In a guerrilla war, the population is the battlefield. Women were central to that population strategy. They carried intelligence. They supplied fighters with food and medicine. They managed underground networks. They organized demonstrations. They talked to enemy soldiers, sometimes convincing them to defect, or to refuse orders, or to look the other way. And sometimes they fought directly. Ho Chi Minh himself named the members of the long-haired army the long-haired warriors, honoring the traditional Vietnamese style of women's dress while explicitly recognizing them as soldiers. In 1965, Jin was elected chairwoman of the South Vietnam Women's Liberation Association and was appointed deputy commander of the South Vietnam Liberation Armed Forces, the highest combat position held by a woman during the war. She later described the army's approach. They attacked on 3 fronts simultaneously: armed struggle, political struggle, and what she called proselytizing, working to turn enemy soldiers against their own command. She was clinical about it. She acknowledged that the women placed in hotels and offices near American bases were there to gather intelligence and sometimes to plant bombs. Here is a detail that American military records, declassified after the war, make clear. U.S. forces were specifically concerned about women in the long-haired army. They were harder to identify as combatants. They had access to spaces such as villages, markets, service positions near military installations that male fighters couldn't reach. Their networks were informal, local, and nearly impossible for an outside army to penetrate or map. American soldiers described being unsure how to deal with demonstrations led by women carrying children. How do you open fire on a crowd of women? Some did. Many didn't. And when they didn't, the demonstration won. Jin reflected on this later in a remarkable 1981 interview. She acknowledged that the Americans were quite leery of Vietnamese women, and then noted that because they also liked Vietnamese women, enabling the women to attack them. The National Liberation Front's strategy of combining political, armed, and social pressure, the 3-pronged attack, is now studied in military academies as one of the most effective asymmetric warfare strategies of the 20th century. Jin was a key architect of that strategy in the South. In April 1974, 1 year before the fall of Saigon, Nguyen Thi Dinh was promoted to Major General, the first woman to hold that rank in the Vietnamese People's Army. She directly participated in commanding the final campaign to liberate Saigon in the spring of 1975. The war she had been fighting since she was 16 years old ended. Vietnam was reunified. After the war, she continued working. She became a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam. She served as deputy chairman of the Council of State from 1987 until her death. She was vice president of Vietnam in all but name. But the work she cared most about in those years was preservation. She had watched women's contributions be minimized, misattributed, or simply forgotten. She had seen male commanders receive credit for strategies she had designed. She had watched the international narrative of the Vietnam War become almost entirely about men. So in 1987, she founded the Vietnamese Women's Museum in Hanoi. She wanted the record to exist. She wanted photographs, stories, letters, and artifacts from the women who had fought and worked and died in the revolution to have a home before the people who could provide them were gone. She died on August 26, 1992. She was 72 years old. Outside Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Dinh is almost unknown. The Vietnam War dominates a significant portion of Western historical memory. In film, in books, in television, in journalism. It is one of the most documented conflicts in modern history from the American perspective. And yet, the women of the National Liberation Front, who were arguably the backbone of the guerrilla war in the South, are almost invisible in that documentation. Part of this is simply the perspective from which the war was recorded. American journalists and filmmakers followed American soldiers. North Vietnamese generals appear in Western histories. Southern NLF commanders, especially women, do not. Part of it is ideological discomfort. Nguyen Thi Dinh was a communist. She killed people. She ordered operations that killed people. She is not a comfortable hero for audiences who prefer their historical women to be nurses or suffragists, not generals who describe using female agents to plant bombs near American bases. And part of it is the structural bias that this entire series has been about. The tendency to write history from the top down, focusing on heads of state and named battles, and to miss the organizing, the logistics, the community-level work that actually determines the outcome of conflicts. Dinh did all of that. She was brilliant at all of it. And for most of the world, she doesn't exist. There is a passage from Dinh 1981 interview. She is asked how she survived all those years, the imprisonment, the loss of her husband, the decades of war. She says, "I tried to suppress my pain and turned it into a driving force in order to be able to continue with my activities and to avenge my country and my husband." She spent 56 years in the revolutionary movement, from the age of 16 to her death at 72. She spent time in a French colonial prison. She lost her husband to that same system. She raised a son largely alone. She founded an army. She became a general. She built a museum so that other women wouldn't be forgotten. Ben Tre Province is sometimes nicknamed the land of the coconut for its palm groves, its rivers, its particular character. Nguyen Thi Dinh is its most remarkable daughter. She deserves to be remembered far beyond its borders. Thank you for listening.